the base game made so special was the power of the Japanese ma. The FD has 4 sections. The prelude, telling the story before everyone got onto the ship. Fuga, retelling the story of the first game from the LI's point of view. Concerto, the classical after story. And Fantasia, a little gimmick story. The prelude has 1 chapter for each character, starting with Masamune, and elaborates a bit more on the mission and setup of the ship, as well as the structure of the world organization. You learn a bit more about each character's past, and how they already grew closer until you enter the ship with Koharu. At first, I was greatly annoyed by this section, as the game forces you to play that first, and it took longer than expected with about 7 hours, with obviously no kiss scene in sight. But I nevertheless didn't even think a single second about skipping, as I was immensely interested in learning more about the lore and world organization. Also, the characters' banters were almost more entertaining than in the first part. And every character had his shining moments, like learning about Senri's mark, or Itsuki and Sakuya fighting all the time, so that I actually liked each character more and more the more I played that section. The Fuga is the main story from the first game from the LI's point of view. It's a bit shorter with about 2 hours of new content and 2 hours of repeated scenes from the first game. Here as well, I first wasn't sure whether it's worth playing or just like repetition of the first game, but the added thoughts of the LI made it so much easier to understand their actions, which was greatly appreciated for Kakeru in my case. I like him way better after playing Fuga. And not only did they add the LI's thought and additional scenes, each Fuga route also got 1 or 2 additional CGs, the last of them always being a romantic couple CG. So I highly recommend playing this section for multiple reasons. In case it's already some time ago you played the main game, it's a great refresher revisiting the most important moments. And especially Sakuya's Fuga route gives a good rundown on the most important information concerning the world organization. And then secondly, it might make you like characters more than you did in the first game if you didn't quite understand them in the first game. The concerto are the typical after stories taking place directly after the good ending of the main game. And what I highly appreciate about these after stories is that they have a character-driven and a plot-driven part. The character-driven part being about their personal or relationship development, and the plot-driven chapter tying up the revelations of the main game or continuing the story with the world organization. So you will be happy if you want sweet romance, but also if you're curious about what becomes of the characters and what further happens with the world organization. I played the characters starting with Koharu, then Mikoto and then Nanami, but if you want to avoid spoilers, I'd recommend to play Masamune last. Playing Kakeru's Fuga route, I understood how clever and rude he actually is, but also could relate way better to the love progression. It still feels a bit quick, but knowing his thoughts at least didn't make it feel as surprising. As well in the Fuga as in the concerto, they added a nice additional layer with some more background story concerning his father, which made his character even more tragic and the relationship to Koharu even more wholesome. In the concerto, Kakeru is first looking for his part in life, like the most characters in the concerto route, and finally confronting his past a last time. Playing Senri, I realized how bad-mouthed and pessimistic he is. And playing the Fuga from his perspective really made everyone seem like such major pushovers. Again, this section really helped me understand his reactions. In his concerto route, his major conflict, which wasn't properly addressed in his route in the main game, is finally tackled and handled really well, giving a lot of room for Senri but also Koharu's character development, followed by a little plot involving the world organization, and another metaphor about a beast and a bird, which made me cry again. Koharu and Senri have such a precious dynamic, which is emphasized splendidly in the afterstory. I felt Masamune's point of view in the Fuga added the most additional information about the setup of the whole mission and his contact with the world organization. I also loved to see his inner conflict laid bare in his point of view, struggling between what he told is right and what he thinks himself is right. And I think in his Fuga route they also added an additional scene, which is now my new favorite scene, with Koharu and Masamune being in full Masamune mode. You know what I mean? And I felt experiencing his route another time with all the additional scenes and his additional thoughts made him even more attractive, and without a doubt, he gains my most sexy award again. I actually replayed some scenes so much I like them. And afterwards I played a bit of Jacono Lila, just to hear him moan more. And his concerto route was so action-packed. They got entangled in a plot of the World Organization, which challenges their love and what they believe in. And I loved it so much. This plot showed both characters from new perspectives, and it was immensely captivating to see them grow, going through these hardships. Also, the character-driven part of this route was so cute and wholesome. And I think they even managed the conflict, which was created at the end of Masamune's route in the main game, quite skillfully, without leaving a bitter taste, and even presented the dire fate of the main game as a blessing in disguise. And cute Koharu shone with her naive and forgiving nature. So for me, Masamune is Koharu's true root. Sakuya's Fuga route, as the others, managed to explain some of his more surprising behavior and gives the best rundown on the lore. So in case you can't remember everything, I'd recommend to play him first. In his concerto route, he is even more doting than in the first game, if that was possible. But again, fights a rather cliched conflict on how to have an equal relationship with Mikoto. The plot section, on the other hand, presented a new and highly controversial conflict regarding the future of the World Organization, which felt most similar to the conflicts of the main game in its implications. In his route, they also added a new fairy tale metaphor, which kind of worked but didn't impress me as much as the one in the main game. Itsuki's Fuga, as well as meeting him in the prelude, finally made me appreciate his character a bit more and see more in him than just the sly flirt. In the concerto, he continues to be flirty and is one of the most lovey-dovey allies. I don't think he has much else going on in his head than icha-icha. The plot section dived deeper into his past, and it was highly interesting for me to finally learn more about his past and family, as we didn't learn too much about it in the main game. To my very surprise, I perceived their relationship as extremely wholesome, and it was a pleasure to see Itsuki fight for them. Natsuhiko's Fuga is similarly filled with background information, like Masamune, as he spent the beginning of the route separate from Mikoto, so there's a lot to learn about his life until then. And as soon as they spent time together, I enjoyed him gradually starting to respect her until he just cannot help but fall in love with her. And reading his thoughts made him appear even more caring than in the main game, and I really understood how similar these two actually are. In Concerto, he is similarly straightforward like Itsuki, but their lovey-dovey times are sadly interrupted by some plot knocking at the door about the World Organization, which almost took Shuin novel-ish turns, of course not as dark, but still very sci-fi messed up. And at the same time, you see him open up to others, which made his route the most harmonious and hopeful, and made him enter my top 3 characters of the game. Granted, I liked Heishi better playing his Fuga, but still I'm convinced that Senri's character development in Heishi's route is way more meaningful than Heishi's character development. I think it's because he's actually as airheaded and naive as he seems, which is the same in the Concerto route, where he doesn't even grasp the gravity of the situation. So in Concerto, I think Nanami has the more interesting character development, though learning a bit more about Heishi's past was still arguably interesting, though it didn't really give this character some more needed depth. Ron is the character who needed the FD the most, because there's no way you could completely figure him out just in the main game. So luckily his Fuga explains his actions a bit more relatable, though parts of his character still remain a mystery. But especially the ending of the main game was more understandable. And due to that very ending of the main game, the after story, let's say, leaves a lot of room for character development. Yet feels a bit strange and certainly lacks the charm of his route in the main game. I think it's what happens often with unhinged characters, that they just grow softer over time. What might be welcomed by some, but for me, it's just a shame. Though the advantage of his route was that it featured a lot of lovey-dovey scenes, often with a bat involved. Liking Akito the most, I played him last, as I don't think there were many open questions concerning him after the main game. I just enjoyed experiencing his route again in the Fuga and witnessing how Nanami slowly lifts his burden. In the Concerto, they live together with Koharu, Kakeru and Senri, which is such a cute dynamic, as in the other routes you don't really see the other characters as often, and in the plot section Nanami's past haunts her, which causes a tangible yet cliched relationship development. With Akito being my favorite, I was a bit disappointed in his route, as he didn't have many lovey-dovey scenes, and also their plot felt rather insignificant compared to some of the others. To say goodbye to the game, I recommend the Fantasia section. A silly additional story of 3 times half an hour length, where everyone suddenly turns into chibis and has to solve challenges in order to turn back. While the challenges for Koharu's boys were really sweet, as they had to overcome some problems like Masamune holding back on Koharu despite having eaten a lot of sweets. The others were quite nonsensical, like hunting a bird or running away from pervy Setsu, who should definitely own a root. This section gives you some funny and silly interactions, but are by no means meaningful. There's not much to say about the art I didn't already say in my initial review, but they of course added CGs, which look pretty as well, but somehow don't have this magical feel to them. And they also added more sprite variations for most characters, also including a baby sprite. So adorable, I love them. Of course we also get some new background art for the new setting and also some more background music, so you can immediately notice they try to add as much as they can. Just sadly you have to obtain the BGM with a silly minigame, where you have to walk around the map, talk to your respective allies so they give you tickets, with which you can buy the BGM. And the only thing they didn't add is a route for pervy Setsu. Certainly would have been a great laugh. I feel like the Japanese was a bit more difficult than in the main game, now ranking it upper intermediate. And if you're interested in learning Japanese with Otome games, you can become a Lavender patron and wish for a special game, like Norn for example, to play on our special member stream. Learn Japanese with it while I make the Anki cards for you, and thereby vastly support my channel, like my current patrons and members. Thank you so much! Before I come to the tone section in comparison to the main game, I have to remind you about why the base game was so amazing and what made it so special. What the base game made so special was the power of the Japanese ma, the space in between. In culture and arts like the Noh theatre, it is what the actor doesn't say or doesn't do. The space in between the lines, what is left unsaid in a conversation, the waiting, the unanswered question, the bigger picture. And Norn9 Var Commons made great use of this, not explaining everything, just hinting at some actions, without telling them explicitly, expecting you to fill the gaps for yourself. That is what made the main game so intriguing, having the courage not to spell everything out, with the risk of course of being misunderstood or overlooked. That is for me an aspect of clever and skillful writing, letting the reader think for themselves. Be it some open questions concerning the revelations, or what characters did behind the scenes. It is all there if you look closely. It's all hinted at in little details. You just have to figure it out for yourself. And especially taking the power of Ma into account. It's clear what is the difference between the main game and the FD. While the main game lived off uncertainty and open questions, the FD is much more straightforward in that regard. If there were things you didn't quite get in the main game, the FD explains it to you in detail. I think where it actually adds content is concerning the characters' pasts. It's a good chance to get to know the characters better, especially the ones you maybe didn't like that much in the main game, because their point of view might help you understand them better and eventually grow to like them. Also, the character-driven part of the after stories adds romance and character development, just like you would expect it from a good FD. Then with the plot part you get more action, more background information, or even some deep, interesting side characters who have their own story to tell, and with that, imitating the revelations of the main game, though on a much smaller scale. And if you care about these revelations, I'd recommend to play Masamune last, and Sakuya and Heishi first, maybe Itsuki, but for example Kakeru, Senri and Ron don't really have new plot revelations. What was quite surprising for me was the overall length of the game. The prelude and playing through each character took me 7 hours each, which means the FD actually took me longer than the main game. So you definitely get some value here. Unlike other FDs though, this FD doesn't solely focus on fluff, but also plot, so you could argue it's half FD and half sequel actually. And I totally get why they made another FD, Act 2, which is more of a spin-off, with extremely short extra stories and mainly additional fun scenarios with the characters. Because, very unusual for me, I just couldn't get enough of the characters. Playing the club or Yunohana FD, I didn't feel like they really added much, but with Norn I feel as if I could watch them grow forever and wonder what other interesting stories they might have to tell. After the main game I was so happy I could spend more time with them in the FD. And after the FD, which turned out to be more a sequel in disguise, I wouldn't mind a real FD with even more lovey-dovey scenes and character arcs. Sadly, the third Norn game Act 2 doesn't feature a lot of sweet romance, but rather tells more side stories like a school side story or the Norn RPG scenario. But I do think that will still be enjoyable for everyone who loves the cast as much as I do, but who isn't as focused on sweet romance. So who is Norn9 Last Era for? It's definitely for everyone who enjoyed the first game, that's a no-brainer, as you will get a good mixture of plot and romance again, though it lacks the mystery elements and revelations of the main game. I also think it's for people who didn't like the main game, because maybe you didn't get the plot or didn't like a certain character. But then to read the main roots from the LI's point of view helps so much to empathize with them, and I think that should be mandatory for every FD. It's so much fun and adds another layer to the story. And the roots spell out the truth about the mission for you in extenso without leaving room for interpretation or more. Thus, the sequel might be better perceived than the main game in the Western audience, who might be unfamiliar with that concept in the main game. But while Norn Last Era doesn't have the power of Ma, it still encompasses the general magic of visual novels. How you can learn in this video what makes Otome games and visual novels so special.